Good afternoon to all our listeners. Good afternoon and welcome back to another episode of Roose's Book Club. My name is Simbrit Smith. I am the social media manager and I am one of the founders, co-creators of Roose's Book Club.
And I'm Ryan Robinson, Parent Chief, the founder and director of Future Leaders Bermuda, which is the organization behind Roose's Book Club. Welcome.
So we are here with another episode. And just to recap, on the last one, we got into a very interesting discussion around Dr. Eva Hudson's book, The Experience of Racism in Bermuda and its Wider Context. And we really dove into her critique and her criticisms of Black leadership, how party politics replaced the fight against racism, and how their platforms, we questioned. We throw out to the audience, did those platforms, did the ideologies of these political parties then cause division in the Black community? So we looked at lower versus middle class. We looked at the isolation of Black educated Bermudians and how a lot of the ideologies, because they didn't prioritize the needs of everyone, did it kind of replace the collective efforts that happened, and did it then prioritize aspiring to white comfort?
And the relevance of that book at that particular time is, if you've been following the journey of Roose's Book Club for the last few episodes, we started out looking at The West and the Rest of Us by Chinwezu, where we talked a little bit about the origins, going back to the hundreds of years of colonization and even before it, because that was a question of how did we get here? And we traced that on through to Dr. Eva Hudson's book, because we are connecting that origin story in the motherland with Bermuda and the societal issues that we're facing today. So as Sam is referring to, Dr. Eva Hudson really took it right up until the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even present day, talking about different critiques of party politics, of Black leadership, of the quote-unquote Black elite, the isolation between educated Black Bermudians, upper, lower class, and then up until today, questioning the impact of party politics on the Black community.
Right, because then what we do see is like this institutionalized division, right? So now we're having debates and struggles for power and influence for individuals instead of focus on the struggle for justice, for future development of Bermuda. And their followers now become concerned with the personality and the popularity of Black leadership instead of substance and meaningful policy. So one of her quotes says that the Black community had not cultivated a sense of their own worth and ability to solve their own problems. They did not value the strength and power of their own collective action. Committees negotiating with white power structures have always resulted in the least possible success. So one of the conclusions that we reached last episode was that sort of like the counter opposition to party politics is collective effort. And she gave examples of how how collective effort has worked in our favor and quickly in our favor with the Progressive Party and the theater boycott, with Dr. Paulu and the franchise for voting rights. And she directly, she says that these events organized by these people who were not worried about individual power, they were worried about the collective efforts. They were worried about the collective coming together to get the result that benefited the needs of every Black Bermudian.
So that brings us to the transition into today's episode. The last episode being the politics of personality. Today we're excited because we're transitioning, going back. We gave you a little bit at the beginning on that global context, and then we took it very local with Dr. Eva Hudson's book. So we've explored how we ended up here as a race and as a nation in the context of history. But now we're going back. We looked at a Bermuda example with Dr. Eva Hudson, and now we're transitioning and we're introducing our next book as we come towards getting up to finish this season of Roose's Book Club. So let's transition over and just do tidying up on this recap and introducing this next book. So the West and the rest of us set a historical lesson for understanding colonialism, and the experience of racism in Bermuda and in its wider context gave us perspective on the failures of local leadership and the effects of racism. Now that those foundations are set, where does this next book take us? So we're looking at Destruction of Black Civilization by Chancellor Williams. It's a really exciting book because in this book, Chancellor Williams delves deeply into both the internal and the external factors that contributed to the decline of African civilizations. He writes about Africa's pivotal role in the development of human culture and intellect, even before colonization, and unravels the systematic and systemic destruction and the deliberate intent behind the oppression, the marginalization of Black civilizations across the continent. And he generally challenges some of those Western Eurocentric narratives that have long dominated our understanding of world history.
And one of the things that Williams argues throughout the entire book to really kind of captivate what he is trying to say is that the downfall of Black civilization wasn't inevitable, that it was a result of both the external oppression and the external, like the deliberate external intention to make Black nations fall. But it was also coupled with the internal weaknesses that the African continent had. And it was really interesting going to this book because he brings in the perspective of not just the tribalism that happened, but also just the natural terrain and nature and the natural disasters that occurred during African civilization.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's a really powerful book because what Chancellor Williams does is he looks at Africa and different societies across Africa before colonization. So I know sometimes we maybe have a vague understanding of, oh, well, this is what we were, or Black civilization existed long before slavery, but we don't really go deeper than that. We kind of just have this general idea that there were people there and, you know, we were kings and queens. And, you know, some people will say, right, kind of cliche. But what Chancellor Williams does is he actually goes and looks at specific societies, you know, from the South to the North to the East to the West. And he names specific societies and cultures and really breaks apart and unpacks sort of their contribution to not just African society, but to the world. He looks at their different systems of governance. He looks at their religion and how they identified racially and based on their ethnicity. And he really goes deep and sort of, it's like this whole book is like an encyclopedia, really, because he goes into the different cultures and he uses that to really identify certain weaknesses, certain conditions, certain factors that may have influenced how the continent ended up going into the state it was in with being colonized, with slavery, or the rest. Because we all know that slavery wasn't limited just to Black people or the African continent, right? And yet there's still a very unique experience when you look at the transatlantic slave trade, when you look at African society and its destruction. So although we're recognizing this is not unique in the sense of slavery and oppression, we are looking at how specifically did this relate to us as a people and the African continent? What actual weaknesses can we identify to explain this situation and hopefully get out of it, right? And so one of the immediate things that we're looking at here is history is not just about dates or names of battles. It's about people. It's about patterns. It's about things that we've tried before, things that we have to learn from, the way that our society was set up and what might that have led to, right? On page 43 of the book, Chancellor Williams says, learning our history is useless unless we learn what our strengths and weaknesses were. And that's the aim that we're hoping to fulfill with Roose's book club. We're not just here to spit out trivia or facts, right? Or just to give opinions. We actually want to use the lessons and these academic studies and these narratives that have been reviewed and analyzed by some of our ancestors and use that to our strength by picking apart where can we learn, where can we grow, how can we relate that to the current society. So with that being said, go out and get The Destruction of Black Civilization by Chancellor Williams. The full title is The Destruction of Black Civilization, Great Issues of a Race from 4500 BC to 2000 AD. And that in itself tells you just how far back Chancellor Williams goes, long before slavery commenced in the context of transatlantic slave trade. Go out and get the book because we're starting it now in terms of unpacking it, and we're going to spend 2 episodes on this. But today's episode is called Radical Context because we're trying to use this to shift. We've done the Bermuda stuff in the last episode. We're going back now, placing everything back into context, understanding that there's a long history leading up to where we are today.
So I remember when we first started this book, because we actually had to go through it twice because, like Rai has said, he is so extensive and so thorough in his research. And he starts with retelling the story of Egypt, of Nubia. I was about to say Namibia, and I was like, that's a corn country. But he starts off with kind of reframing the context of African nations, especially ones that have been centered as sort of like Asian nations and definitely had white control take over. Mm-hmm. So when you're looking at the history of Egypt, especially when you're looking at the context and the day in which he wrote this book. Mm-hmm. So he really writes this in the context of trying to challenge African history through the lens of Asian and European or Western centering, mm-hmm. right? And that was one of my favorite things about this book, because with this being the first book that we read when mm-hmm. we first started out the book club, it was such a radicalized context, a radical reframing of what Africa was like before colonization hits. And that's the whole purpose of his book, because he wants it to serve as a reclaiming of African history, rebuilding of African and Black identity, with us at the center of the story.
You actually just reminded me that this was the first book we read, although mm-hmm. it's not the first book that we're covering in the curriculum, because I think what you guys realize is how heavy this book was, and we said we can't start out with that one. But this is the first one that we read, and it's quite fitting that we're coming to it now as Simbrit, you talk about radical context and looking at different perspectives. Mm-hmm. Because if we go to Chancellor Williams' book, The Destruction of Black Civilization, in the foreword, in the intro, before he even gets into the book, he talks about what our first point of today is, and that is the importance of recognizing different cultures and their different perspectives in academia. So, for example, right now in the modern Western era, much of what we learn, whether that's at university or whether that's in school, whether that's on television, is from a Western point of view, right? Mm-hmm. And that has its own assumptions, its own narratives. And Chancellor Williams starts off this book talking about what he calls the European journey, because this book took a long time for Chancellor Williams to write, and he actually didn't want to publish it when he did. He was going blind, and he had no choice but to publish. But he himself, after conducting all of his own studies on Africa, the continent, amidst all his research, he actually studied at Oxford, and he went and visited, and he spent some time there. And he talks a little bit about why he went there and the importance of looking at different perspectives. So what I don't want us to do is, with Roose's Book Club, have this assumption that we're disregarding everything else, that everything we've learned is a lie and we need to throw it out. Because Chancellor Williams' whole point is, as a people, as Black people, there's actually value in looking at the other perspective, looking at alternate perspectives, and then trying to figure out what our own perspective is. And I think what we don't do a lot of is we'll either pick one or the other. We either totally reject mm-hmm. one side, right? Like we'll say we're not listening to any of the white or the Western point of view, or that's all we know. And so to read this book was very interesting for me, because Chancellor Williams really looks and tries to maintain a level of, I'll say, objectivity, mm-hmm. where he can be in one place and learn and listen and then kind of compare his own notes in his head.
Yeah, I agree, Rai, because one of the things that I learned with reading this book, it was specifically around the how and the why of Africa being colonized. So he says, like, the how and the why of Africa being colonized matters more than the when, right? But it made me think critically of the how and the why all of history and all of our understandings of where Black issues or, slavery, those things, where they started. A lot of times when we're taught these things in school, it's just about the man. And that's why putting things in a Western and a white perspective kind of does for the education when it comes to understanding African and Black history, because the concern is not the people that it was to.
It's just, what year did this happen, and when did that happen,
just,
and then this happened.
Like you said, it's dates, right? Mm-hmm. It's dates and it's events, and that's it. When I was reading through, and we were reading through Chancellor Williams's works, it was so interesting to learn about a perspective that looked at the how and the why, looked at how things came to be, what caused it, sort of like the snowball effects, where things kind of became a tipping point, because it creates not just a story, but it allows you to kind of really understand what we experience throughout all of it, and it centered us as a people. Now, what's really interesting is the fact that you mentioned, you went to Oxford, just like Chancellor Williams did, and the why you went to Oxford. I remember when you got your Rhodes Scholar, and there was a lot of pushback, and I think a lot of people kind of didn't understand why you chose to go the route that you did. So can you kind of shed some light on your journey, and where are some of the parallels that you see in yourself, your own journey, and the why you chose to go to Oxford with Chancellor Williams and even this book and these writings?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the word is like serendipity, God's plan, all of that, because it's crazy, right? I remember reading this book and seeing so many parallels, and it just affirmed my decision. Because yes, there were questions asked, when I accepted the Rhodes Scholarship, because the Rhodes Scholarship it's known as the most prestigious scholarship in the world. It's specifically tied to Oxford University, but the name is after Cecil Rhodes, who's one of the very perpetrators of the oppression that we're talking about in these books on Black people on the African continent, all the rest, right? And so there was this, I guess, conflict in people's minds of, well, how could you be pro-Black or, reading these books on, African history and Black power and nation building, and then go and accept a Rhodes Scholarship and go to a place like Oxford and then learn and listen to what they're teaching you, right? If we turn to page 24 on Destruction of Black Civilization, we learn that Chancellor Williams actually did the same. And I quote, he says, "I arrived in England in the fall of 1953 to begin formal studies at Oxford University, primarily through the Institute of Colonial Studies and at Rhodes House." He says, "In addition to the study of documentary sources on Africa, I had other objectives. The first objective was," he says, "I wanted a more direct, close-up view of the European mind, its real attitude toward the Black world. I sought to study both," and this is the second thing, "the extent to which European wealth and power were derived directly from Africa, and number 3, the nature and philosophy of a European education that was shaping and determining the mentality of Africans." So Chancellor Williams says that he was already well aware of the different effects of white supremacy or the effects of Western imperialism on the African mind and on Black Americans. But he wanted to really get a close-up comparison of how he viewed the world and what he thought with actually what is being taught at some of these top universities. What are the ideologies that are being perpetrated? What is the minds of the people, and how do they view us? So in a way, it's almost like he stepped outside of himself and put himself in a oppositional environment just to look in the mirror and really reflect on how we are viewed by the outside. And I think that's something we don't necessarily do. We're living in this one world under oppression, but do we actually try and remove ourselves entirely from the situation and flip the camera back on us? So he says, finally, I wanted to know, again from direct study, exactly what made Oxford one of the so-called greatest universities in the world. What were the specific elements of that greatness? Was great teaching a factor? And if so, who were the great teachers and what made them great teachers? So he talks all about different reasons, and he immersed himself fully. He says he didn't just have a look in and leave visits. He would do all-day studies at the schools, remaining throughout the periods in the classrooms, talking with the students, teachers, and principals. So he genuinely wanted to grasp a full perspective on how are we being viewed as a people from these top institutions? Let me get in their heads and see, like, what are they seeing about us? Interestingly enough, he studied and he stayed at Lincoln College, which is the same college that I went to at Oxford. So Oxford has a collegiate system. So there's over 30 different colleges and, campuses within the university. And I didn't even know this when I selected Lincoln. I was just told this is where a lot of the Caribbean scholars and all the rest go, right? So it was just very interesting and reassuring that when I went there, it was for a very similar reason, which is, okay, I have my mentors at home. I've learned a lot in my upbringing from the Eugene Johnstons and the Ajala Umadeles and there are Bermudians that really took me up under the wing when I was growing up, right? And then my parents and my family. So my upbringing was already one where I got a lot of that Afrocentric perspective. Not that it was there from the very beginning, but I felt like I had a grounding where I should be able, and this is what true Black authentic education should do, right? Mm-hmm. You should be able to, with the knowledge and the empowerment you've received in the home and in your community, go anywhere, be able to go into any algorithm or environment and remain and have an authentic perspective and be able to just reach out and compare. Because that's what other races and racial groups do, right? When somebody comes from, whether that's Asia or Europe, they can go to Africa or they can go to the US and they have their own grounding and just observe, right? But for us, because we don't have that, let's say, confidence culturally, it's this big deal when we go into a different space because now we feel like we're going to be morphed and shaped into someone else's mold. So it's very interesting to me, to read back on Chancellor Williams's journey, because he essentially says the reason why he was safe going to Oxford and getting that perspective, because he says studying under white teachers and professors should be most rewarding. And it can be if you do not enter white institutions with a head like an empty pitcher going to a fountain to be filled. He says, and I quote, I was safe and richly rewarded during my studies in white universities only because I happened not to be so naive that I expected the viewpoints of the conquerors to be the same as those of the conquered on matters relating to our place in the world. And that summarizes my intentions, when I went and studied public administration and policy at Oxford, because not only did I learn different perspectives and things I hadn't known, there was cutting edge research on how governments are run and leadership and education and health and economics and finance. But at the same time, in the back of my head, I said, okay, what are they not talking about? What's outside the box that they're not going into because they think and know that they're the best and the greatest? What perspectives are they missing? And when you can enter a place, and if any young Bermudian can enter a different environment with their own groundedness and then go and learn the other top perspective, it's only going to make for a more holistic experience, because amidst all of that greatness, if you're not caught up in the hubris and the ego and if you're not enthralled and enchanted by all of that, and you're not got the blinders on, you can actually look and say, well, what else are they even missing, even in that greatness?
And it's so great that you kind of end on that, because one of the points that he makes with the sort of the ability to push back against being in white education or Western education is that there is bias there, because he asked the question, he kind of asked the question, like, who is the authoritative figure in education systems? And it is predominantly, well, that's starting to shift now, but it used to be predominantly white voices. And so who is the one that's telling the history? Who's
Right.
the one that's writing history books?
Who decides why did World War One start?
Exactly.
Who decides, why this, particular group got colonized or enslaved over the other? Who tells that and puts that in the books, right?
And who decides what part of the story to tell?
Mm-hmm.
Or even to be able to come outside of themselves and take on a different perspective or tell it from a different lens, right?
There's one more thing I want to add that he talks about, Chancellor Williams, and it ties into what we're going to go to after break, the preconditions for progress, because one thing that I found interesting when you go into these white spaces, and I mean, even when I was in law school at Durham, I remember sitting in a class where they talked about the foundations of law, and there are certain things that they just say as a matter of fact, like it's as if 1 + 1 = 2. And one of those things was talking about how democracy started in ancient Greece. And that's something that I know a lot of young black people were like, no, it didn't, like we know that. But they will sit in a lecture hall of hundreds of people and say that. They know that too. So it's very interesting to me, right, that there are certain concepts that are still taught, even though we all know it's just not true. And Chancellor Williams ends that section where he's talking about why he went to Oxford with the point saying the Europeans were confronted with a real social democracy that existed long before the terms socialism and democracy were invented in the West. And he talks about a particular professor who referred to a lot of the ways that Africans govern themselves as savage, right? And he called it savage, the professor, because the people were the real rulers, in fact, and not in theory. And if you think about the context of Europe's development, right, they were colonizing and conquering and plundering at a time when they themselves had royalty and kings and queens, right? And you had peasants and all the rest. So their total idea of development was we have these wealthy people at the top who are fit to lead and all of that, right? Meanwhile, in a lot of African societies, as we later learn, you had fully self-governing communities where anybody who was considered a ruler was really not the actual ruler. They were just the person who forms consensus and brings the different opinions together and then identifies what that was, right? So it's very interesting because this whole point was, while we're here in the modern era learning about the isms and socialism and democracy and this and Westminster, there was a whole system and structure that thousands of years ago had been developed. I'm not saying it was all over Africa, but in general sense, many societies across Africa had different ways of governance and leadership that we're now, hundreds of years, we're just now trying to figure out when we look at what we consider modern now with like Scandinavia and those Nordic countries and the ways that they, and Switzerland and direct democracy. And it's like these same concepts existed so long ago. So when we talk about these alternate perspectives, it's just fascinating to me that, Chancellor Williams was going back deep into the history to show that a lot of the things that now are quote unquote cutting edge, even in the Western white academian context, we had long before and were considered savage for it. And in many cases, it was actually a weakness for us.
And I can't wait till we get into that. But another of one of his critiques is the bias in white academia and the fact that the bias centered a white audience. And it didn't even want to regard or didn't even care to regard a different perspective. I remember when I was taking one of my psychology classes at Bermuda College, and we were going through language and how language developed, the basis of it, and we talked about phenotypes. And my professor from the textbook taught us that, only like 70 exist. So the sounds that make the words to form pronunciations, only 70 exist. And I was like, that's a really small number when you think about the amount of languages and creoles that exist in the world. And I instantly remembered an Oxford study from a Bermudian, and I cannot recall her name right now, so I apologize, but she talked about how old school Bermudians, we had our own phenotype that existed just for Bermuda. So I went up to my professor after class and I asked him, does this include indigenous languages and creoles from like people of color? And I could see on his face that he was completely stumped. Like the question had never even occurred to him. And this is not always a sort of like a critique of white academia to say that they are horrible people. It just goes to show how centering whiteness, centering Western history, ideas, perspectives doesn't even make space for anything else, for anyone else. And it really causes issues because we don't get a chance to really address some of the struggles, some of the hardships that add to the Black struggle and Black experience when you're talking about things like racism and colonialism. And then it puts us in a position where we also kind of are a part of our own erasure. But when we get back, we will dive more into the topic of the white academia versus Western academia. And then we'll kind of go into our second point about preconditions for progress. So now that we are discussing recentering African history and the Black perspective, what is it that we actually need? And what is it that we had before all the issues of colonization and racism appeared? What did we have that set us up for success, for development in society?
Brilliant. So you're listening to Roose's Book Club. This is Radical Context, Episode 5. We're talking about the destruction of Black civilization, and we'll be back with more after the break. Roose's Book Club is presented to you by Future Leaders Bermuda, registered charity number 1009. The views expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect the views of our organization or any of us in our professional capacities. However, the content of all discussions is rooted in carefully curated learning material, and in that sense, not everything expressed is merely an opinion, but a reflection of our research and the aims and objectives of our organization as a whole. In all our activities at Future Leaders, we encourage independent thought with a community-centered and social justice-minded approach that enables listeners to gain a better understanding of themselves, disrupt the status quo, and take charge over their futures. We ask you to listen with this in mind.
Welcome back to all our listeners. This is Roose's Book Club, and today's episode is titled Radical Context. We are delving into our next book, The Destruction of Black Civilization by Chancellor Williams, and today we're discussing topics on a white academia versus Afrocentric academia and preconditions to progress.
So before we went to break, we were talking a little bit about the comparisons of academia. And the relevance of that is essentially not just about looking at things from a Western perspective versus an Afrocentric perspective, but really appreciating the value in how these different perspectives actually can make for a holistic understanding. What I mean by that is we're not saying it's one or the other. It's not the Western perspective is wrong and the Black perspective is right, or that we need to delete our minds fully of the white perspective and adopt this fully Black one. It's actually understanding that there is value in hearing what the other side has to say, because it might actually help you refine your own assessment of yourself. So when we're talking about it in the context of academia and schools and universities, we talked a little bit about how Chancellor Williams, the author of this book, Destruction of Black Civilization, studied at Oxford in order to listen to what the perspective was, or the dominating, these are the world's leaders, these are the cutting edge theorists. What were they saying about the Black race? What were they saying about Black civilization? What was their take on history? And then measuring that up against his own research that he did, so that for every point or for every perspective that was the mainstream, he also was able to do his own research and make a comparison. And so we believe that through doing that, he was able to receive an authentic representation of Black history. And the point that we're trying to make is that that can actually allow us to correct some of the historical inaccuracies that traditional education has committed by omitting or changing certain facts. Teaching and study of African history might outrage a lot of Western or Arab scholars because the focus has shifted from those Arab, Asian, European, or whatever backgrounds to the Africans in Africa themselves. But learning that history from the various perspectives is essential for a well-rounded and inclusive education by acknowledging the full breadth of human experiences, because there's your truth, there's my truth, and then there's the truth. But the reality is, we have our own lived experiences, and there's also an objective perspective. But when it comes to things like historical events, it's really just about what side you're looking at it from and what narrative you're telling, because the same thing can happen, but it be analyzed differently depending on whether you're looking at it from the perspective of, white history or black history, or, are we trying to analyze for strengths and weaknesses, or are we just looking at what happened? So the whole point there is drawing on those experiences of Chancellor Williams, his research in the book. And we also talked a little bit about my personal experience at Oxford and attending, and how I also tried to adopt that same mindset of not going like an empty vessel waiting to be filled, but going with my own rooted, my background, my knowledge of self and culture, and then hearing, what these top scholars and academics were saying. So learning about the history of the black race also prior to colonialism challenges that narrative that the black history is simply about struggles and hardships. And so that's one thing that Chancellor Williams does a good job of in looking at that history of the societies and the democracies, the cultural practices, the ways leaders were chosen before Europeans even set foot in Africa. And so the question we left with on that point about looking at different academic perspectives is, how does exploring black history from a black perspective and also comparing and referencing other perspectives and drawing them in, how does it contribute to a greater appreciation of the actual diversity within our cultures and communities and the ways that we see the world? So that's where we left off before we went to break. And I think we have enough time in today's show to kind of dabble into the next big point that we want to draw out of just the initial reading, because this is, again, these books are hundreds of pages long. So we're just picking out a couple points because today's episode is on radical context. In other words, trying to put the current situation of Bermuda and our people and African people and black people, trying to put it in context and look at it from different angles and look at it from different perspectives. That's the point of today's show. So we're going to dabble into the second point here, preconditions for progress. You want to take over, Sam?
Yeah.
Okay.
So one of the sort of even one of the pillars for Roose's book club is nation building. And what Chinwezu speaks to when he talks about preconditions for progress is...
Chancellor Williams.
Sorry.
You're still on West than the rest of us.
I am. What Chancellor Williams, my apologies, speaks to is looking at what are some of the elements needed for success, for developing, for pushing a civilization forwards. And these are points that he noted and he researched that black civilizations, African civilizations have even before colonization occurred. So how did they build their nations? How did African empires and ethnic groups of people and African powers that arose and fell, what did they have in order to start the building blocks of trying to establish a nation?
I think that's so interesting, because when we talk about black history, we really do, even to this day, often start with either slavery or just before slavery, right? And with Chancellor Williams' book, again, the full title is The Destruction of Black Civilization, Great Issues of a Race, from 4000 BC to 2000 AD. Right, exactly. So even before we get to the Oxford, the Western perspective, the slavery, he's talking about, when we say preconditions for progress, we're talking about like the Bourbon's human society, because we know that Africa was the cradle and the birthplace of civilization, which means tens of thousands of years ago, when it was just the basics, there were certain things that had to line up for a society to develop, right? So when we talk about preconditions for progress, we're literally going way back. We're not even talking about just theoretically. We're talking about the ways that Africans' experience was unique. He looks at it from a very holistic perspective, not just in the culture, but also in leadership, the system of governance, and the environment, right? Because we know that the African environment, and when I say environment, I don't mean theoretically, I mean the nature, the land, the the weather, the seasons, even that affects, right, the strength and weakness of the society, what they're able to do. So I just wanted to slip that in there, Sam, because when we say preconditions, we're talking about going right back to the root of how a group of people in one place can actually go from, hand to mouth farming, eating, right, into growing into a culture and a community.
And he says there must be a number of preconditions without the genius of any people for thinking, inventing, discovering, and building. So the first one is people must become famine-free and able to settle, and they're roaming from place to place in search of food and water. And he speaks to this because as he takes it back to kind of the beginnings or some of these struggles and barriers in people being able to settle and develop, he talks to some of the barriers that nature kind of gave. So there were widespread famines that forced people to have to move. There were difficulties in being able to settle in a place like the desert that doesn't have much water, doesn't have a whole lot of shelter from the elements. And going through his account of those kind of pieces really was different because, again, when we talk about Africa, we center it around slavery and colonization. He, again, takes a look at it on so much more of a holistic view. And I love that because I think it brings us back to ourselves as a people, right? So the first one is the ability to settle and the need to roam for food and water. And then he says finding suitable territory is the second one. The third one is there must be a developed sense of national community, which
so when
is
we talk
so
about,
interesting.
Well, when he talks about finding suitable territory, he says after they found suitable territory, the leaders must proceed through negotiations with other neighboring societies and fragmented groups to nation building, right? So the first one is you have to be able to feed yourself and settle, right? That's the bare basics just to have a level of, food, shelter, water. And then the second thing is now you're organizing, you're leading, right? So leaders must proceed and negotiate with others. So either you might be infringing on territories near you, or there's different dispersed groups, ethnic groups, cultural groups, families that you need to sort of try and build a community with. And he uses the term nation building, right? But then the precondition to this is what you're referring to, Sam. And he says there must be a sense of national community among the various groups that make up the country.
And when he talks about this is inclusive of the language. He says various language groups that make up the country. But it also includes things like culture, like your music. How do you commune and socialize and build together? What are cultural identifiers that associate you and make you feel a sense of belonging and connection to this group? How do you commune? What does your family structures look like? And that one stood out to me because if we're talking about Bermuda, we really struggle in this area of being able to identify both. Actually, we struggle in the second one too. Firstly, of being able to put together our own identities, our identifiers of what is Bermudian culture, what makes a Bermudian, but also being able to figure out other groups that we align with, to figure out how we then connect and become diplomatic partners and have working relationships with other groups of people who also align with our history, with our cultures, with who we are as a people. We haven't done that work yet.
And this is just ingredient number 3 of nation building, right? And we're on page 54 of The Destruction of Black Civilization. And he says on that point that you just made, Simbrit, this is so important, and I quote, "This is so important that it cannot be left to wishful thinking or chance. It must be programmed in such a way that a sense of loyalty and of being an important part of a great united brother-sisterhood, which is the nation itself, will develop naturally and allow for the other elements of preconditions of progress to exist, which are, he goes into point 4, which is once you have these things, you got your food, shelter, water. Once leaders are able to bring fragmented groups together, once you have a sense of community that's programmed where people have a sense of loyalty and care for each other despite their differences, that then is what will allow for other things like defense and army, law, justice to apply equally to all classes in society, people feeling secure as individuals, that in their country there is justice for all. So he says, in short, certain conditions in a country can bring about that internal peace, stability, and confidence, which unshackle the mind because there is now time to think. One should not bleed in feet, right, for hundreds of miles across rocky deserts, like you said. You know, once you don't see your kinsmen fall out to welcome death, once you are not fighting over territory, land, resources, once your leaders and your leadership can cooperate with each other, that's when people now have time to think and prosper. And he says there's nothing mystical about the reasons why one group of people can easily become physically and mentally strong while another becomes physically less strong or less mentally alert. And that's because the system is what matters, right? Mm-hmm. And the culture and the environment in which you're operating. And so he concludes that point by saying the system is so structured worldwide that black people are forced into conditions that can even lead to genetic inferiority or other environmental factors causing them to have certain, when we talk about even health, right? So overall, there has to be a breakthrough, he says. And this is why he goes into this section, because he ties right in full circle into how the fact that these elements and preconditions for progress have broken down is actually, it actually can lead to death. Mm-hmm. It actually causes not just the fragmentation of society, but it actually has physical effects on us as a people. So he says we just have to begin that mass organization again into nation building.
And this is where we draw the parallel back to things we've said in previous episodes. This is part of doing the work, and this is part of educating and learning about where root causes come from. Because when we look at Bermuda today, it's easy to point out the issues. We know what the problems are. But because we haven't done the work and we haven't really taken the time to understand ourselves as a people, we don't even know where to begin to start in fixing the issues that we have.
We're still looking at symptoms.
We're still looking at symptoms, and we're trying to fix, we're trying to fix the healthcare system, and we're trying to fix the education system. Notice how Chancellor Williams didn't mention any of those things. He really covered the literal basic building blocks of what we need to do to build a nation, any nation. And when you read this list, you can see how we're missing so many elements. Mm-hmm. And it's not because, again, one of the quotes he said is that this didn't happen by happenstance. It was deliberate. It was intentional. And so now we have to kind of ask ourselves as a people, how badly do we want nation building? How badly do we want development for Bermuda? And what's the work that we're willing to do to get there, right? One of the questions we have in the curriculum is to really sit in and examine what makes a strong black society. What are the basic things that we need? And Chancellor Williams has he has laid that out for us here. Mm-hmm. And I said this in the pilot episode of Roose's Book Club. When we were going through these books, a lot of the solutions that we're looking for, we find them in the works that our elders did. They already did the work for us. Mm-hmm. So we now have to really be diligent in going back and understanding the root issues. We have to leave trying to just pick at the symptoms because we're going to find ourselves back in this position again.
So with that being said, looking at our key takeaways for today, because we're going to spend another episode on this book. Chancellor Williams's book has about 370 pages. Today we read excerpts from pages 24, 25, 53, and 54. That's it. So there's a lot to unpack in this book. We're just touching on some key elements, and I mean very light touches on this book. Today we've talked a little bit about the importance of recognizing different perspectives, not just disregarding or discarding quote unquote white perspectives or white history or Western knowledge, but actually using that to complement our understanding of our own. But a precondition for that is we have to first have our own grounded sense of self, so that when we enter white spaces or go to top institutions around the world, we're not going in empty and just lapping up everything that we hear, but we have our own basic cultural understanding from home, from family, from culture, from community, so that we can go anywhere and still maintain our sense of self. And when we're able to combine those perspectives is when we actually can reflect on our strengths and weaknesses, which we didn't get into today, but we'll save for the next episode, which is really what Chancellor Williams intended to do here, which was analyzing the specific factors which led to colonization, following those thousands of years of the upbringing and growth of African society, so that we can analyze, where our weaknesses are and vulnerabilities were. So we talked a little bit about that, and then we went into some of the basics around preconditions, or the basic things you need to build or start a civilization through nation building. And that's kind of funny, because we talked a lot about how we weren't going to come on this show and just jump to solutions, but we did say there'll be some nuggets in there. And even with that small reading today, we were able to get very simply into some of the very basics that, as we look for Bermuda and our growth and our nation building, some of the basic things we need, which are firstly food, shelter, water, right? That's the survival mode element, but also the ability of our leaders and our different fragmented groups to bring these different peoples together so that we can cooperate and have a sense of common understanding and common culture and a collective, what we would call a national consciousness. In other words, a recognition of our brother and sisterhood and how we relate to each other. Having that, which can then allow us to fulfill the other elements that are needed to actually make a society. So those were just the 2 points that we pulled out of Chancellor Williams' book today. And on our next episode, we're going to come back and get a little bit into understanding our strengths, our weaknesses, why and how colonization happened after those thousands of years of greatness. How were we able to be ripped apart and oppressed and have our systems and structures and nations dismantled? So the takeaways for today are, as I just mentioned, understanding the importance of the different perspective, understanding the basic building blocks for society, and then we want you to think and have some reflection as you go and read this book on what are some of the vulnerabilities that have allowed us to be in the state that we're in today. So go out and get the book, Destruction of Black Civilization, Great Issues of a Race, from 4500 BC to 2000 AD. This has been Roose's Book Club. Anything you want to add, Sam?
Our next show is going to be on October 9th. So we want to encourage you guys to follow us along on all our social platforms at Roose's Book Club. So that's at ROOSESBOOKCLUB.
And this is brought to you by Future Leaders Bermuda. And if you want to check out our website, it's futureleaders.bm/Roose's Book Club. The next episode will be our last episode of the season, where we're wrapping up this whole segment, this whole season of Roose's Book Club, our very first ever, which is all around foundations. So when you come back on October 9th, we're going to finish up on Destruction of Black Civilization for the time being, and we'll wrap up the season.